Hello there, precious traveler. Yes, you who have found your way to this quiet sanctuary tonight, carrying within your heart the accumulated weight of hours that have tested your strength and tried your spirit. Welcome to this sacred refuge we've prepared together, this gentle harbor where the storms of daily life cannot reach, and where peace becomes not just a distant hope, but a present reality settling softly around your shoulders like the most comforting embrace. I see you there in whatever space has become your resting place this evening, perhaps weary beyond words, perhaps carrying burdens that feel too heavy for any one person to bear alone. Know that you are not alone now, and you have not been alone today, though the noise and demands of modern life may have convinced you otherwise. You have arrived exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be here. And there is nowhere else in all the world you should be in this moment, except right here, breathing with me, allowing your spirit to remember what rest truly feels like. Take a moment now to simply notice where you are. Feel the surface supporting your body completely, whether it's the familiar comfort of your own bed, or a chair that has become your temporary sanctuary. Notice how gravity itself is holding you, requiring nothing from you except your willingness to be held. Your body has carried you faithfully through another day of challenges and choices, conversations and concerns, and now it can finally rest. Now it can remember that it was created not for endless striving, but for peaceful dwelling in the love that sustains all things. Let's breathe together now, you and I. 3 deep and nourishing breaths that will begin to wash away the residue of today's anxieties and tomorrow's uncertainties. Breathe in slowly through your nose, filling your lungs with air that carries more than oxygen, air that carries possibility and promise, and the whisper of hope that speaks to hearts grown weary from too much trying and not enough trusting. Hold that breath gently for just a moment. Not with tension, but with the tender care you might use to hold a sleeping child. And now release it slowly through your mouth, breathing out not just carbon dioxide, but the accumulated stress that has taken up residence in your muscles and your mind, letting it go as easily as dandelion seeds released into a summer breeze. Again now, breathing in peace, breathing in the knowledge that this moment belongs entirely to you and to the love that has drawn you here. Feel your chest expanding with more than air, expanding with the realization that you are held by something infinitely larger and more tender than your troubles. Hold it gently, this gift of breath that comes to you without effort or earning, this simple miracle that sustains your life moment by moment without your conscious participation. And breathe out now all the things you've been trying to control, all the outcomes you've been worried about, all the people you've been trying to fix or please or understand, releasing them into the hands of love that are far more capable than yours. One more time, breathing in the assurance that you are exactly where you belong, that your presence here is not accident, but appointment, not coincidence, but divine coordination between your need for peace and heaven's desire to provide it. Your lungs are filling now, not just with air, but with acceptance, with the revolutionary truth that you don't have to earn your rest or deserve your comfort, or prove your worthiness to receive the love that created you. And as you release this breath, feel yourself releasing the day that is ending and the day that has not yet begun, dwelling fully in this sacred, now where healing happens and hope is restored to hearts that had almost forgotten how to believe in tomorrow. Notice now how your breathing has naturally begun to deepen and slow, finding its own perfect rhythm without any effort on your part, like waves finding their eternal pace against an ancient shore. Your heart, too, is settling into steadier beats, no longer racing with the urgency that drove you through the hours, just past, but finding instead the calm cadence of someone who knows they are safe, loved, and completely accepted exactly as they are in this moment. You are not alone in this peaceful space we're creating together. All around our world tonight, other seekers like yourself have found their way to this same sanctuary. Other weary hearts seeking the same rest you're discovering. Other souls hungering for the kind of nourishment that cannot be found in any earthly provision, but flows abundantly from the source of all comfort and hope. Some who join us tonight have walked the path of faith for many years, their hearts familiar with these rhythms of grace, but always hungry for fresh encounters with the love that first captured their attention. Others may be newer to spiritual seeking, their spirits cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before, drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore. Whether you come as a seasoned pilgrim or a curious seeker, whether your faith feels strong tonight or fragile, whether you arrive with gratitude or with questions, with hope or with weariness that runs deeper than physical tiredness, you are equally welcome in this community of hearts that recognize their need for something beyond what this visible world can provide. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening moments in contemplation of eternal things speaks to something beautiful awakening within you, some deep recognition that your soul was made for more than the endless cycle of work and worry that consumes so many of our days. Tonight we are going to embark on a journey together, not the kind that requires packing or planning or any form of earthly preparation, but the most sacred kind of travel that happens when we allow our spirits to be transported across time and space by the power of story, by the gentle magic that occurs when ancient truth meets contemporary need in the quiet chambers of an open heart. We will walk together through landscapes that existed 2,000 years ago, breathe air that carried the scent of olive groves and desert flowers, listen to voices that spoke in languages we don't know but carried truths we desperately need to hear. Feel yourself beginning to let go of the familiar markers of your current time and place, the digital clocks and electric lights, the constant hum of machinery and the endless connectivity that keeps us tethered to a world that never stops moving, never stops demanding, never stops insisting that we produce and perform and prove our value through what we accomplish rather than finding our worth in who we are. These sounds and sensations are fading now, becoming distant and unimportant as we prepare to step backward through the corridors of history into a world where time moved differently, where people measured their days by the sun's journey across the sky rather than the relentless ticking of clocks. Can you feel it beginning, this gentle shift from the harsh fluorescent urgency of contemporary life to the softer, more natural rhythms of an ancient world where sacred and ordinary dwelt side by side without embarrassment or apology? The air itself seems to be changing as we breathe together, becoming cleaner and warmer, carrying scents your modern senses have never experienced, but your soul recognizes as the fragrance of home, of belonging, of a place where weary travelers have always been able to find rest for their souls. As your body continues to release its hold on the tensions and concerns that have defined your waking hours, as your mind gradually lets go of its compulsive planning and worrying and analyzing, you are becoming available for the kind of encounter that changes everything. The kind of meeting that happens not between strangers, but between hearts that were always meant to find each other. Always destined to discover in one another the love they had been seeking, without knowing where to look. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. The world we are entering together exists in a time before the noise of engines and electronics, before the harsh glare of artificial lights that never acknowledge the natural rhythms of day and night, before the relentless pace that has convinced so many hearts that rest is laziness and stillness is wasted time. Here, in this ancient landscape unfolding around your relaxing spirit, the very air pulses with different possibilities, carries different promises, whispers of truths that were old, when the world was young but remain eternally fresh to anyone willing to receive them with childlike wonder. Feel your feet touching ground that has been walked by countless pilgrims before you, worn smooth by the sandaled feet of shepherds leading their flocks to green pastures, of merchants traveling between distant cities with goods and stories and hopes for profit that would feed their families for another season, of ordinary people whose names history has forgotten, but whose faithfulness to daily love has left invisible impressions on the very stones beneath your feet. This is the earth of Palestine, sun-warmed and blessed by rains that come in their proper seasons, soil that has been tended by generations who understood their work as partnership with the divine, as cooperation with forces larger and wiser than their individual understanding. The landscape stretches before you in rolling hills covered with olive groves that have stood sentinel over these ancient pathways for centuries, their twisted trunks speaking of endurance and patience, their silver-green leaves catching light that seems different from any illumination you have known in your modern world. This is light unfiltered by pollution or processed through artificial sources, light that comes directly from the star that has warmed this particular patch of creation since the beginning of time, light that will later shine upon the face of one whose presence will transform everything it touches. Scattered across these hills are villages built of stone that came from the very ground on which they stand, houses that seem to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing themselves upon it with the aggressive architecture of later ages. The homes are simple but sturdy, designed by people who understood that buildings should provide shelter without displaying wealth. Who knew that the most beautiful dwelling is one where love makes its home, regardless of the modesty of its external walls? Windows are small but welcoming. Doors are generous and usually open to neighbors and strangers alike. Rooftops serve as gathering places where families come to catch the evening breeze and watch the sun paint the sky in colors that no earthly artist has ever managed to capture completely. The air carries fragrances that have been lost to most of our modern experience. The clean sweetness of wild honey, mixed with the earthy richness of bread baked in outdoor ovens. The warm scent of wool from sheep that graze on hills covered with grass and wildflowers. The subtle perfume of frankincense and myrrh that speaks of prayers offered with materials that cost their offerers real sacrifice but were given gladly because they understood worship as the most natural response of hearts that have recognized divine goodness. Listen carefully and you can hear the sounds of this ancient world beginning to penetrate your consciousness, replacing the mechanical noises that have surrounded your life with gentler rhythms that match the deeper pulses of creation itself. The lowing of cattle as they are led to water in the evening coolness. The voices of children playing games that require nothing more than imagination and the simple joy of being alive. The sound of grain being ground between stones by hands that understand this work as sacred cooperation with the forces that turn seed into sustenance, earth into abundance, ordinary moments into opportunities for gratitude. Water moves differently in this world, flowing in streams that follow courses carved by divine intention rather than human engineering, pooling in natural basins where sheep can drink and women can draw the precious liquid that sustains all life. The sound of water over stones creates a music that speaks to something deep in the human heart, a rhythm that has been calling people to prayer and reflection since the first human beings walked beside the first rivers and recognized in their flowing something that pointed beyond itself to the source from which all refreshment comes. The people of this land move with a different quality of presence than you have known in your own time. Their steps unhurried because they understand that the most important destinations are not geographical but spiritual. Their eyes clear because they have learned to see beauty in simple things. Their faces marked by sun and wind and honest labor, but illuminated by something deeper than physical health. These are people who have maintained connection to the seasons and cycles that govern natural life, who plant and harvest according to rhythms they did not create but have learned to trust. who understand their lives as part of a larger story being written by hands infinitely wiser than their own. You can see them now as evening begins to settle over these ancient hills. Families gathering for meals that begin with prayers of thanksgiving, spoken as naturally as breathing. Children listening to stories told by grandparents whose memories stretch back to their own grandparents' stories, creating chains of narrative that connect each generation to truths that transcend individual experience. Their tables are simple, but their fellowship is rich. Their food modest, but their gratitude profound. Their dwellings humble, but their hospitality legendary among all who have experienced the welcome offered by hearts that understand love as the most practical of virtues. The religious life of these people flows seamlessly through every aspect of their daily existence, not compartmentalized into special buildings or designated hours, but woven through the fabric of ordinary moments like golden thread through simple cloth. Their prayers rise as naturally as their breath, their awareness of divine presence as constant as their awareness of sunlight or air, their trust in divine providence as fundamental as their trust in the ground beneath their feet. They have not yet learned to separate sacred from secular, to divide their lives into spiritual and mundane categories, because they understand all of life as gift, all of breath as blessing, all of existence as opportunity for wonder and worship. The synagogues that serve as centers of their communal worship are built of the same stone as their houses, designed for gathering rather than impressing, for learning rather than displaying, for community rather than hierarchy. Here children learn the ancient stories that connect them to their ancestors and their destiny. Here adults wrestle with questions that have challenged human hearts since the beginning of thought. Here voices join in prayers and songs that carry both individual longing and collective hope toward heaven with confidence that they are heard and cherished by the one who created very vocal cords that offer them. As darkness begins to deepen over this ancient landscape and oil lamps flicker to life in windows that glow with warm welcome rather than harsh illumination, you can sense an anticipation in the very air itself, as if all creation is holding its breath in expectation of something unprecedented, about to break into the predictable patterns of human history. The stars appearing one by one in the clear desert sky seem brighter and closer than any stars you have seen from your modern vantage point, and the moon rises with a radiance that speaks of purposes beyond mere illumination, of light that carries meaning as well as visibility. This is the world into which we are about to meet one whose presence will change everything, whose words will outlast empires, and whose love will prove more powerful than death itself. But for now, we are simply soaking in the beauty and peace of the time and place that shaped his human understanding, allowing ourselves to be prepared by its rhythms and its reverence for the kind of encounter that transforms hearts and heals souls and restores hope to spirits that had almost forgotten how to believe in the possibility of joy. Chapter 3. The man from Nazareth. In the small hilltop village of Nazareth, nestled among the green hills of Galilee like a precious stone set in the crown of ancient beauty, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere around him. Though to casual observers he appeared remarkably similar to every other Jewish man of his time and region. His name was Jesus, and while his hands showed the honest calluses of years working with wood and stone, while his face bore the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, and his eyes reflected the deep browns and golds of earth that had nurtured him, there was something in his gaze that made people pause and look again. Something that spoke of depths beyond measuring and wisdom beyond his years. He had grown up walking these same winding streets where we find ourselves now, playing as a child among these ancient olive trees whose roots ran deeper than memory, learning his first lessons about life and love and the mysterious ways of the divine from parents, whose faithfulness had already marked them as extraordinary among their neighbors. Joseph, the village carpenter, had taught him that broken things could be mended with patience and skill, that raw materials could be transformed into objects of beauty and utility through careful attention and persistent love. Mary, his mother, had shown him through her own example what it meant to trust completely in divine purposes, even when those purposes challenged every human expectation and conventional understanding. The workshop where Jesus had spent countless hours learning, Joseph's trade was filled with the sounds and scents that would forever remind him of the dignity of honest labor, the satisfaction that comes from creating something useful with one's own hands, the quiet joy of seeing potential realized through the marriage of vision and effort. Here among the wood shavings and the careful measurements, among the tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen, and the projects that would serve families for decades, Jesus learned lessons that would later flower into parables about building on solid foundations, about trees being known by their fruit, about the patience required for any work that truly matters. But even as a young boy, there had been something that set Jesus apart from his companions in ways that only became clear when people looked back years later with the gift of hindsight and understanding. The village elders remembered conversations that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple words, questions that penetrated to the heart of matters they had never thought to examine so deeply. Responses that revealed understanding far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from someone of his age and experience. When he listened to the ancient stories in the synagogue, his attention was so complete and his questions so insightful that grown men found themselves reconsidering truths they thought they had mastered years before. The religious leaders of his day would eventually struggle to categorize him. These men who had spent their entire lives memorizing the intricate details of scriptural law, but had somehow lost sight of the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment, like life-giving water through parched ground. They inhabited a world where faith had become complicated and burdensome, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed to exclude rather than include, to burden rather than bless, to separate the supposedly worthy from the obviously unworthy, rather than revealing the divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction or qualification. Jesus had grown up watching ordinary people struggle under weights they were never meant to carry alone, observing how the light in their eyes dimmed when they felt disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve, witnessing the way shoulders sagged beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting. He saw how the simple desire to love God and neighbor had been buried beneath centuries of interpretation and debate, how the joy of divine relationship had been replaced by anxiety about ritual correctness, how the freedom that should characterize life with God had been exchanged for a nervous striving that could never find rest because it never found acceptance. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undiminished by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when faced with the world's confusion and pain. In Joseph's workshop, he had learned that restoration was always possible, that what seemed ruined could be made beautiful again through the application of skill and patience and love. These lessons in the repair of broken things would become the foundation of everything he would later teach and demonstrate, the living proof that no human heart is beyond the reach of divine grace, no life too damaged to be made whole, no situation too desperate to be transformed by love. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with the confident arrogance of occupying forces, their presence a constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both their physical survival and their spiritual integrity. Revolutionary movements flickered and died like brief flames in strong wind, leaving behind only more suffering and tighter restrictions, more suspicion between neighbors, and less freedom for a people who remembered stories of independence and divine favor. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn the established order upside down. He would demonstrate that the kingdom of God advances not through violence or political maneuvering, not through religious debate or philosophical argument, but through the revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply the assurance that they mattered to someone who would never abandon them regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances. But for now, he was simply Jesus of Nazareth, approaching the age when Jewish men traditionally began their public ministry. His heart already full of the love he would soon pour out for the healing of the world, but his public work still waiting for the proper time. The divine appointment that would launch 3 years of ministry that would change the course of human history forever. He walked the same dusty roads you are walking now in your imagination, breathed the same flower-scented air that you are breathing in this peaceful moment, looked up at the same star-filled sky under which you are now resting, carrying within his fully human heart mysteries that would soon be revealed to anyone whose heart was prepared to receive them. His daily life was filled with the ordinary activities that characterized every young man of his background and region, but there was an extraordinary quality to the way he engaged with even the most routine tasks, a presence that transformed simple interactions into opportunities for grace to be glimpsed, for love to be experienced, for hope to be kindled in hearts that had grown accustomed to disappointment. Neighbors would later remember that conversations with him left them feeling somehow more themselves, more hopeful, more aware of possibilities they had forgotten existed in a world that often seemed designed to crush dreams and diminish expectations. The hidden years of his life, the decades between his childhood and the beginning of his public ministry, were spent in patient preparation for work that would require him to understand human experience from the inside, to know through personal participation what it meant to live within the limitations and struggles of mortal existence, while never losing connection to the infinite love that had sent him into the world for its salvation. Every day spent working beside Joseph, every conversation with neighbors, every Sabbath spent in worship and learning, was preparing him for the moment when he would step onto the stage of history and begin to reveal the heart of God in ways that no amount of religious teaching or philosophical discussion could ever accomplish. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun was painting the sky in gentle watercolors of rose and gold when Jesus made his way through the rocky terrain toward the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful preaching of a wild-looking prophet, whose message of repentance and preparation had stirred hearts throughout the region. This was John, the one who had grown up in the wilderness sustained by locusts and wild honey, clothed in camel's hair, his entire being radiating the intensity of someone who had spent years learning to distinguish the voice of God from every other sound competing for human attention in a world full of distractions and false promises. John's voice carried across the flowing water with the authority of ancient prophecy being fulfilled in real time before the eyes of anyone with spiritual perception to recognize it, calling people to genuine transformation of heart and mind rather than mere external observance of religious customs that had lost their power to change lives. The crowds that came to him represented every stratum of Palestinian society, from wealthy merchants to desperate beggars, from learned scribes to simple farmers, all of them sensing that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time. something that demanded a response deeper than intellectual curiosity or casual interest. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities found themselves under conviction about choices that had enriched them financially while impoverishing them spiritually, their questions revealing hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of compromise and moral flexibility. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to God, their weapons temporarily set aside as they contemplated the possibility that there might be a different way to find security and meaning than through the application of force and the cultivation of fear in others. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts hungry for authentic spiritual renewal, others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence. Pharisees and Sadducees, who normally maintained careful distance from each other, found themselves standing side by side in the presence of someone whose call to repentance made no exceptions for religious credentials or social status, whose vision of divine judgment and mercy cut through human pretensions to address the condition of the heart alone. The baptism that John offered was not merely a ritual washing, but a powerful symbol of death and rebirth, of old life being buried beneath the waters and new life emerging purified and renewed, ready for the kind of transformation that goes far deeper than external behavior, modification to touch the very core of human identity and purpose. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging their need for cleansing they could not provide for themselves, confessing their hunger for righteousness they could not achieve through their own efforts, expressing their readiness to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and ambition. Then, one morning that began like so many others, but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, Jesus appeared among the crowd, not as a spectator observing a religious phenomenon, but as someone seeking to identify completely with the human need for purification and renewal. When John saw him approaching through the gathered multitude, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation, the arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this morning. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive understanding of the reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, the roles should be reversed, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary to fulfill divine purposes, to complete the picture of his identification with human experience, to demonstrate that he had come not to stand apart from human need, but to enter fully into it, including the process of cleansing and consecration that prepares hearts for divine service. As Jesus descended into Jordan's muddy waters, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shift and change, as if all creation held its breath in recognition that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of a ministry destined to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history. The water that had cleansed countless others now received the one who had no need of cleansing, except for this moment of perfect identification with the humanity he had come to save, this demonstration of divine willingness to participate fully in human experience, including the longing for purification and new beginning. When Jesus emerged from the water, streaming with river water but radiant with something far more significant than physical cleansing, the heavens opened in a way that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed. The Spirit of God descended upon him in the form of a dove that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings, settling upon his head with a gentleness that spoke of divine approval and affection beyond human measurement or understanding. Then came the voice, audible to some, though not to all, words that revealed the eternal relationship between Father and Son, while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the long-awaited time had finally arrived. That the promises made through centuries of prophetic hope were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other penitent sinner, despite his complete freedom from sin. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," the voice declared. And those words carried across the water and through the centuries to every heart that has ever wondered about their own acceptance by divine love. Their own standing before the throne of infinite grace. After his baptism, Jesus didn't immediately begin the public ministry that would make his name known throughout Palestine and beyond. Instead, he withdrew to the wilderness for a time of fasting and prayer, a period of intensive spiritual preparation for the work that lay ahead, a season of testing that would prove his readiness for the battles between light and darkness that would characterize every day of his public service. The desert became his classroom, silence his teacher, solitude his companion as he wrestled with questions about methods and priorities, about the nature of the mission he had been sent to accomplish and the means he would employ to accomplish it. In that wilderness, away from the crowds and expectations and distractions that would soon surround his every movement, Jesus faced temptations that went to the heart of what it means to trust completely in divine provision. To resist the shortcuts and compromises that might accomplish immediate goals while undermining eternal purposes. To remain faithful to love even when power offered easier paths to influence and acclaim. He emerged from that desert testing not weakened by hunger and isolation, but strengthened by deeper communion with the Father, clarified in his understanding of the mission before him, confirmed in his commitment to demonstrate divine love through service rather than force, through sacrifice rather than domination. The first disciples who would be called to follow Jesus were ordinary working men engaged in the daily tasks that sustained their families and communities. Fishermen whose hands knew the weight of nets and the feel of fish scales, whose bodies were accustomed to long hours under sun and stars, whose hearts carried this simple faith of people who had learned to read weather patterns and trust their lives to forces beyond their control. When Jesus walked into their lives and spoke those two words that would change everything, "Follow me," they found themselves unable to resist an invitation that promised adventure they could not imagine and transformation they had never dared to hope for. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant shades of purple and gold, and the morning air carried the fresh sweetness of water and growing things. Jesus sat down to teach the crowd that had been following him with increasing eagerness as word spread about this rabbi, whose words carried power unlike anything they had ever heard before. The natural amphitheater of the hillside allowed his voice to reach everyone present without strain, while the beautiful setting of lake and mountains created an atmosphere of peace that prepared hearts to receive truths that would challenge everything they thought they knew about God and life and the meaning of human existence. The gathering that morning represented a cross-section of Palestinian society that would have been remarkable in any other context. Wealthy merchants sitting beside poor laborers, learned scribes mixed among illiterate farmers, mothers holding babies next to elderly men whose bent backs spoke of decades of hard work under unforgiving sun. What united them was not social status or educational background, but a hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, a longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into the silence like seeds into prepared soil. each phrase carrying both immediate comfort and long-term challenge. Each teaching overturning conventional wisdom while revealing deeper truths about the nature of divine love and human purpose. He didn't speak in the technical language of theological debate or the elaborate rhetoric of political oratory, but in words so simple that children could understand them, yet so profound that the wisest sages would spend lifetimes exploring their depths. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he began, and immediately the world's understanding of blessing was turned upside down in the most wonderful way. In a culture that equated divine favor with material prosperity and spiritual blessing with earthly success, Jesus was declaring that those who recognized their spiritual poverty, their desperate need for something beyond their own resources, were the ones most positioned to receive the infinite wealth of divine love. "The kingdom of heaven," he explained, "belonged to them not despite their emptiness, but because of their readiness to be filled. Blessed are those who mourn," he continued, and hearts throughout the crowd began to lift as they understood that their grief was not evidence of divine displeasure, but invitation to experience comfort that could only come from the source of all consolation. Their tears were not wasted water, but precious offerings. Their sorrow not meaningless pain, but preparation for joy beyond anything they could imagine. Their losses not final defeats, but opportunities for divine love to demonstrate its power to heal and restore and make all things new. Each blessing he pronounced challenged the assumptions of a world that celebrated strength while dismissing gentleness, that admired aggressive achievement while overlooking humble service, that rewarded those who grabbed what they wanted while ignoring those who waited patiently for blessing to find them. "Blessed are the meek," Jesus said, "for they will inherit the earth." In a society where power belonged to those willing to seize it through force or cunning, Jesus was revealing that ultimate victory belonged to those whose strength expressed itself through tenderness, whose authority operated through service, whose conquest took the form of love that won hearts rather than dominating wills. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," he declared, transforming spiritual longing itself into a form of satisfaction, making the desire for goodness and justice evidence that such desires would ultimately be fulfilled in ways that exceeded every expectation. Those who ached for a world where love reigned supreme, where justice flowed like rivers, where mercy triumphed over judgment, were already blessed by the very hunger that drove them to seek what their hearts knew must exist somewhere beyond the disappointments of earthly experience. The revolutionary nature of his teaching became even more apparent as he moved beyond blessing to practical instruction about living in ways that reflected divine rather than human values. "You have heard that it was said, 'Eye for eye and tooth for tooth,'" Jesus said, referencing the legal principle that had governed human relationships for generations. "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." This wasn't a call to weakness or passive acceptance of injustice, but an invitation to break the endless cycle of retaliation that kept human communities trapped in patterns of escalating violence and ever-increasing hatred. "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," he commanded, and the very air seemed to shimmer with the radical possibility he was presenting to anyone willing to consider living according to such extraordinary principles. This wasn't merely good advice for those who felt particularly charitable on a given day, but a complete redefinition of what it meant to be human, a call to embody the same kind of indiscriminate love that caused the sun to shine on both righteous and unrighteous, the rain to fall on both just and unjust, the divine heart to extend mercy to all without regard for worthiness or desert. As the day progressed and Jesus continued teaching, using parables drawn from everyday experiences that revealed profound spiritual truths about the nature of divine love and human responsibility, The people listening began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of religious instruction. This wasn't just another teacher offering slightly different interpretations of familiar ideas, but someone who spoke as if he had direct access to the heart of ultimate reality, who revealed truths about God's character and intentions that rang with the unmistakable clarity of absolute authenticity. His teachings about prayer transformed what had become for many a duty performed out of obligation into a conversation conducted in confidence of being heard and cherished by a Father whose love exceeded any earthly parent's care by infinite measure. The prayer he taught them was both simple enough for a child to memorize and profound enough to sustain adult hearts through every joy and sorrow life could present. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. When Jesus spoke about worry and anxiety, addressing concerns that troubled every heart in his audience, regardless of their economic status or social position, his words carried the authority of someone who had never allowed fear to separate him from trust in divine provision. Do not worry about your life, he said, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? His teaching about judging others revealed both divine mercy and human responsibility in perfect balance, showing how forgiveness and accountability could coexist without contradiction in hearts that had learned to see themselves and others through the lens of divine love rather than human prejudice. Do not judge, or you too will be judged, he warned. But this wasn't permission for moral relativism or spiritual indifference. It was recognition that the same mercy we need for our own failures must be extended to others in their struggles, that the same grace we hope to receive must be offered freely to anyone whose heart is open to receive it. When Jesus finished teaching and began to make his way down from the hillside, the crowds followed him in silence that spoke more eloquently than any words could express their amazement at what they had heard and experienced. They had never encountered anyone who taught with such authority, who spoke as if he had personal knowledge of divine truth rather than merely repeating what others had said, who revealed God's heart with clarity that made their own hearts burn with recognition and hope. The religious teachers they were accustomed to built their lessons on the authority of other teachers, creating long chains of interpretation that often obscured rather than illuminated truth. But Jesus spoke as if he knew the mind of God personally, as if he had walked in heavenly places and now brought their light and truth down to earthly hearts hungry for authentic encounter with divine love. The words they had heard on that hillside would follow them home to their daily tasks, echo in their minds as they went about their ordinary routines, transform their understanding of what it meant to live as human beings created in the image of God, yet fallen into patterns of selfishness and fear that separated them from the love for which they had been designed. Some would remember his teachings about blessing and begin to see their own struggles and sorrows in new light, understanding that their difficulties were not evidence of divine abandonment, but opportunities for divine comfort to meet them in their deepest need. Others would wrestle with his call to love enemies and pray for persecutors, finding in themselves reserves of grace they had never known existed, discovering that forgiveness was not weakness but strength, that mercy was not foolishness but wisdom, that love was not sentiment but the most practical force in the universe for transforming hearts and healing relationships and creating communities where people could flourish rather than merely survive. As evening settled over the Sea of Galilee and oil lamps began to flicker to life in the villages scattered along its shores, those who had been present for Jesus' teaching carried his words into their homes like precious treasures, sharing with family members what they had heard, trying to capture in their own inadequate language something of the power and beauty they had experienced in his presence. Children would fall asleep that night, having heard for the first time that they were infinitely precious to God, that their lives had meaning beyond anything they could imagine, that they were loved with a love that would never abandon them, no matter what mistakes they might make or what circumstances they might face. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion. Word of Jesus' extraordinary teaching spread like ripples across still water, reaching into villages and towns throughout Galilee and beyond, carried by merchants and fishermen, by mothers and children, by anyone who had heard his voice and found their hearts strangely warmed by the hope he offered so freely to anyone willing to receive it. But it wasn't just his words that drew increasingly larger crowds to seek him out wherever his travels took him. Stories began to circulate about remarkable things happening when Jesus was present, healings and transformations that challenged every natural law, yet were witnessed by too many credible people to be dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. In the fishing village of Capernaum, where the morning air carried the scent of nets drying in the sun, and the sound of boats being prepared for another day's work on the sea, a Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying, consumed by fever and paralysis that had resisted every treatment the most skilled physicians could provide. This military officer, though representing the occupying forces that many Jews considered their enemies, had earned genuine respect throughout the community through his fairness and his obvious care for the Jewish people under his authority, even going so far as to fund the construction of their local synagogue with his own resources. When the centurion heard that Jesus was approaching the town, something in his heart recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of a completely different kind than any earthly power he had known in his years of military service. His faith was so profound, and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear, that he sent word to Jesus saying there was no need for him to actually visit the house where the servant lay dying. "Just say the word," he insisted through his messengers, "and my servant will be healed." The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to the Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel. The man understood something about divine authority that escaped many who had been raised in the traditions of faith, recognizing that Jesus' power was not limited by physical presence or geographical distance, but operated according to principles that transcended ordinary human experience. And indeed, at the very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, the centurion's servant opened his eyes, sat up in his bed, and asked for something to eat, his fever completely gone and his strength fully restored. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside the shore where fishing boats bobbed gently in the shallow water and children played in the sand while their mothers listened to his words, a woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through the crowd that surrounded him. She had spent everything she owned on physicians who had only made her condition worse, and according to the religious laws of her culture, her ailment made her ceremonially unclean, cutting her off from normal social interaction and preventing her from participating in the worship and community life that gave meaning to existence for her people. She had lived for over a decade as an exile in her own town, watching life go by from the margins, growing weaker physically while her hope gradually dwindled to the faintest flicker. But she had heard about Jesus, about his compassion for outcasts and sinners, about his willingness to touch the untouchable and welcome the unwelcome, about the way he seemed to see past external circumstances to the heart that beat beneath. Her faith was desperate but certain. born from the kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted, yet something in the soul refuses to surrender completely. "If I can just touch the edge of his cloak," she whispered to herself as she pushed through the crowd, "I know I will be healed." When her trembling fingers barely grazed the hem of his garment as he passed by, power flowed from Jesus like lightning, and immediately she felt the bleeding stop, felt strength returning to her body that had been drained by years of illness, felt the shame and isolation that had defined her existence lifted away like a burden she had carried so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him, stopped walking and turned to the crowd. "Who touched me?" he asked gently, his question born not of irritation, but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing by adding the blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity. When the woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by his kindness, expecting rebuke but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth, Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Daughter. Not outcast, not unclean woman, not social pariah, but daughter. In that single word, she was welcomed back into the human family, restored to her place in the community of God's beloved children, given an identity that no illness could steal and no law could revoke. The healing that began with the stopping of her bleeding was completed with the restoration of her dignity, the renewal of her hope, the return of her rightful place among those who belong to the household of faith. The miracles multiplied day after day, each one revealing not just divine power, but divine heart, not just the ability to suspend natural laws, but the passionate desire to enter into human suffering and transform it into testimony of love's triumph over every force that would diminish or destroy the beautiful creatures God had made in his own image. Lepers whose disease had made them living symbols of decay and death found their flesh restored to the purity of childhood, their skin glowing with health they had not known in years, their voices freed to speak words of gratitude after years of having to cry, "Unclean," to warn others away from their contaminating presence. Blind beggars who had spent their lives in darkness, dependent on the charity of others for survival, and never having seen the faces of those who showed them kindness, suddenly discovered a world of color and light and beauty that exceeded their most wonderful dreams. Deaf ears that had never heard the laughter of children or the whisper of wind through olive trees were open to receive the full symphony of creation's song, while mute tongues were loosed to speak words of praise that had been locked inside hearts that had much to say, but no voice to say it. When Jesus encountered a funeral procession leaving the town of Nain, carrying the body of a young man whose death had left his mother not only grieving, but economically devastated since she was now a widow without any male relatives to provide for her care, his compassion was so moved that he could not simply walk past without acting. Death had seemed to have the final word in this woman's story, taking first her husband and now her only son, leaving her facing a future of poverty and dependence on whatever charity her community might provide. But Jesus touched the stretcher carrying the young man's body, and with the same authority he had used to command storms to be still and seas to be calm, he spoke directly to the one who lay silent and motionless beneath the burial cloths. "Young man, I say to you, get up." The effect was immediate and astounding as life returned to the body that had been cold and still, as breath filled lungs that had ceased their function, as the young man sat up and began to speak, fully restored not just to biological function, but to the completeness of human existence with all its potential for joy and love and meaningful participation in the ongoing story of his family and community. Jesus helped him down from the stretcher and presented him to his mother, whose tears of grief instantly transformed into tears of overwhelming joy as she held the son she thought she had lost forever, as she realized that death itself was not final in the presence of this teacher, who commanded even the grave to release its captives. The crowd that witnessed this unprecedented reversal of humanity's most universal experience stood in amazed silence before erupting in praise and wonder, recognizing that they had seen something that spoke of power over life and death itself. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time was not merely the power of his teachings or the wonder of his miracles. Though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed, the truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was the way he moved through the world, the people he chose to spend time with, and the barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by the casual way he dismantled centuries of social convention and religious tradition simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in the eyes of divine love. In the bustling marketplaces of Galilee, where merchants called out their wares under colorful awnings and the air filled with the sounds of bargaining and conversation, where children darted between stalls and women carried water jars with practiced grace, Jesus walked with the relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unlike the religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or social standing, Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of tax collectors and fishermen, prostitutes and farmers, anyone whose heart remained open to the possibility of transformation through divine love. He would pause at a potter's workshop, examining the vessels taking shape under skilled hands and asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in the craft while using the answers as natural illustrations for deeper truths about the divine potter who shapes human hearts with infinite patience and wisdom. At a baker's stall, he would breathe in the warm fragrance of fresh bread and speak about spiritual nourishment that could satisfy hungers no earthly food could touch, his words transforming everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus, sensing in him the kind of adult who would listen to their questions without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their concerns and dreams and fears in ways that made them feel valued and heard. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission, Jesus' response revealed the heart of his entire ministry. "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." He would sit on the ground with them, his teaching robes gathering dust as he listened to their excited chatter about treasures they had found or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than a friend who cared about what mattered to them. In their unguarded trust, their capacity for wonder, their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met, Jesus found perfect illustrations of the faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation or calculation. When a Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during the noon heat, timing her visit to avoid the other women who normally gathered there in the cooler morning hours, she expected to draw her water in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of the shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years. The last thing she anticipated was finding a Jewish rabbi sitting beside the well, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her, let alone ask her for a drink of water. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history and his profound compassion for the loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another, and a futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy the deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her. Instead of the condemnation she expected from a religious teacher, he offered her living water, the kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become a source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. By the time their conversation ended, this woman who had come to the well burdened with secrets and sorrow left her water jar behind and ran back to the very town where she had been living as something of an outcast. So excited about her encounter with Jesus that she could not contain the news. "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did," she announced to the people she had been avoiding. Could this be the Christ? Her transformation was so evident, her joy so authentic, that many of the Samaritans came to believe in Jesus simply because of her testimony. In Jerusalem, during one of the great religious festivals when the city overflowed with pilgrims from throughout the Jewish world, Jesus encountered a man who had been disabled for 38 years, lying beside the pool of Bethesda among a crowd of other sick and disabled people who believed that healing waters would occasionally stir and provide restoration for whoever could enter the pool first. This man had given up hope decades earlier, resigned to a life defined by limitation and dependency, watching others find healing that seemed forever beyond his reach. "Do you want to get well?" Jesus asked him, a question that might have seemed obvious but actually penetrated to the heart of what it means to choose hope over despair, to risk disappointment by believing that change remains possible even after decades of evidence suggesting otherwise. When the man explained his predicament, how he had no one to help him into the pool when the waters were stirred, how he was always too slow to reach the healing before others claimed it, Jesus didn't offer to assist him with the traditional method. Instead, he spoke with simple authority. "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was cured, his muscles that had been atrophied for nearly 4 decades, suddenly strong and responsive, his limbs that had been useless suddenly capable of carrying him wherever he desired to go. He picked up the mat that had been both bed and symbol of his helplessness for so many years, and he walked, not hesitantly or with uncertainty, but with the confident stride of someone whose body had never known limitation. The healing was complete, instantaneous, and utterly transformative, restoring not just physical function, but dignity and purpose, and the hope of a future worth living. These encounters with individuals whose lives were touched and transformed by Jesus' presence reveal something profound about the nature of divine love that transcends the centuries to speak directly to contemporary hearts that carry their own burdens of loneliness, shame, physical limitation, or spiritual hunger. Jesus saw potential where others saw only problems, recognized beauty where others saw only brokenness, discovered beloved children of God where others saw inconvenient reminders of life's fragility and pain. His love was never abstract or theoretical, but always personal and specific, perfectly suited to the unique needs and circumstances of each person whose path intersected with his during those 3 years when heaven walked among humanity in human form. The woman at the well needed someone who could see past her reputation to her thirst for authentic love. The disabled man needed someone who could call forth strength he had forgotten he possessed. The Samaritan villagers needed someone who could cross ethnic and religious boundaries to include them in the circle of divine care. Chapter 8. Fellow Seekers of Peace. As we pause here together in our sacred journey, my dear companion on this path of peace, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful that has been happening in the quiet spaces of your heart as we have walked together through these ancient stories, breathed the same holy air that surrounded Jesus as he moved among the people of his time, and witnessed the same revolutionary love in action that continues to transform hearts in our own day. including yours as you rest here in the gentle embrace of this peaceful evening. You are not alone in this experience of encountering divine love through these timeless narratives. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same sanctuary of rest. Other weary hearts seeking the same comfort you are discovering. Other searching spirits drawn by the same longing for peace that brought you to this quiet place, where modern urgency gives way to ancient wisdom and contemporary anxiety dissolves in the presence of eternal love that knows your name and cherishes every detail of your unique story. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories. This fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures, united not by geography or background, but by a shared recognition that our souls were made for more than the endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of modern existence. Some who join us tonight are longtime pilgrims who have discovered that these quiet encounters with Jesus bring a special quality of rest that cannot be found anywhere else in our hurried world. Others are newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before, drawn by hungers they can barely name but cannot ignore. Whether you have been walking this contemplative path for years, or whether tonight marks your first tentative step into this realm of sacred rest, you belong here completely, exactly as you are, with all your questions and doubts intact, with all your hopes and fears acknowledged, with all your past mistakes forgiven and your future possibilities embraced by love that sees not what you have been, but what you are becoming through divine grace, working patiently in the depths of your being. If these stories of Jesus' compassion have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if his interactions with outcasts and sinners have awakened hope in places of your heart that had grown accustomed to disappointment, if his gentle treatment of children and children, his patient love for confused disciples, has helped you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance, then I want to invite you to consider becoming part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury but necessity, that these quiet moments of encounter with divine love are not optional additions to life, but essential nourishment for souls that were created for relationship with their Maker. By subscribing to our journey together, you are not merely accessing additional content, though there will certainly be more sacred stories to explore, more ancient wisdom to discover, more pathways to the kind of peace that restores weary hearts and heals wounded spirits. You are joining a community of people who understand that slowing down is actually speeding up toward what matters most, that choosing contemplation over constant activity is choosing wisdom over foolishness, that some truths can only be received when we create space for them to settle into hearts that have learned to be still in the presence of divine love. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend. When you choose to walk with us through these sacred narratives, when you allow your heart to be touched by the same love that transformed fishermen into apostles and tax collectors into evangelists, you are participating in something that transcends individual experience and becomes part of the eternal story of divine love pursuing human hearts across every barrier of time and culture and circumstance. Your openness to receive this love creates ripples that bless not only your own life, but the lives of everyone whose path intersects with yours in the days and weeks ahead. Please know that your thoughts and reflections, your own experiences of encountering Jesus through these stories, are deeply valued and welcomed in the comment section below each of these peaceful narratives. This is a sacred space where hearts can share honestly about their spiritual journeys, where questions can be asked without fear of judgment, where testimonies of grace can encourage others who may be struggling with doubt or disappointment, or the simple weariness that comes from trying to navigate life's challenges without adequate spiritual resources. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content online, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their understanding deep enough, or their questions appropriate enough to contribute to conversations about divine love and eternal truth. But remember the disciples we have been observing in these stories. Ordinary men with extraordinary flaws, people who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were loved completely by Jesus and entrusted with the most important message in human history. Your questions matter because they reveal a heart that is seeking. And seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy. Your struggles matter because they connect you to every other person who has ever wrestled with doubt or disappointment. And sharing your struggles gives others permission to acknowledge their own need for grace and healing. Your discoveries matter because they testify to the reality of divine love working in contemporary hearts, proving that the Jesus we encounter in these ancient stories continues to transform lives in our modern world. In the weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that have the power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits. We will journey together through the experiences of saints and mystics who found God in desert solitudes and mountain retreats, discovering how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths. We will meditate on ancient prayers and psalms that have sustained seekers through persecution and plague, through seasons of abundance and times of desperate need, always finding in them fresh resources for contemporary challenges. We will visit the gentle wisdom of Francis of Assisi, who learned to see Christ in every created thing and to hear divine love speaking through the songs of birds and the whisper of wind through trees. We will explore the mystical revelations of Julian of Norwich, whose visions of divine love sustained her through some of the darkest periods in human history while revealing truths about God's heart that continue to comfort hearts today. We will discover how contemplatives across cultures and centuries have found pathways to peace that remain available to anyone willing to walk them with sincere hearts and open minds. Each story we explore together will be crafted with the same care as tonight's journey, designed to help you transition from the anxiety of wakefulness to the blessing of peaceful rest, always intended to remind you that you are beloved beyond measure, always created to serve as a bridge between the chaos of daily concerns and the tranquility of divine grace that surrounds you whether you are aware of it or not. As we prepare to continue our exploration of Jesus' life and ministry, I want you to feel the profound gratitude flowing between us, the invisible bonds that connect all people who have discovered that rest is holy, that peace is practical, that love is the most powerful force in the universe, and the most accessible resource for anyone willing to receive it with the simple trust that opens hearts to transformation beyond anything human effort could achieve. Chapter 9. The 12 and Their Stories. As word of Jesus' teaching and healing spread like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of restoration and hope traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official news, Jesus recognized the growing need for companions who could share not only in his daily ministry, but in his deeper mission of demonstrating divine love to a world that had almost forgotten what such love looked like in practical human terms. From among the larger group of followers who had begun to gather wherever he went, he chose 12 men to serve as his apostles, his sent ones, who would eventually carry his message to the ends of the earth. These 12 were not the kind of men religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority, not polished scholars who had mastered the intricacies of scriptural interpretation, not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to a new movement, but ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived. Their selection revealed Jesus' consistent preference for potential over pedigree, for willingness over worthiness, for hearts ready to be transformed, rather than minds already convinced of their own completeness. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter, brought to the group the passionate intensity of a natural leader, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than the sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years. Peter possessed the kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of grace sufficient for whatever challenges divine love placed before him. His journey from fisherman to fisher of men would take him through depths of failure and heights of faithfulness that would demonstrate how completely divine love could transform even the most unstable human foundations. Andrew, Peter's brother, brought a quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship, the kind of person who preferred to work behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight, whose greatest joy came from introducing others to the teacher who had changed his life. Andrew possessed the gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally, beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years together, with a consistent ministry of connection that built bridges between seeking hearts and the love they were seeking. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick tempers. Sons of thunder, who were always ready to call down divine judgment on anyone who failed to properly honor their beloved master. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations, but required constant redirection from destructive impulses toward constructive expression of their zeal for divine truth and justice. Under Jesus' patient influence, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love, their readiness for conflict channeled into courage for service that would eventually cost them everything they had to give. Philip approached discipleship with the careful, analytical mind of someone who liked to understand things thoroughly before committing himself completely, whose practical nature sometimes struggled with the supernatural dimensions of following Jesus, but whose intellectual honesty kept him asking questions until he found satisfactory answers. When Jesus tested Philip's faith by asking how they could feed a crowd of 5,000 people, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics, his systematic mind unable to conceive of solutions that transcended ordinary human resources and conventional approaches to seemingly impossible problems. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with the skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything significant could emerge from a village as insignificant as Nazareth. His honest questions revealed not cynicism, but genuine desire to understand, not rejection of divine truth, but careful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe without adequate evidence. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all the more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance. Matthew brought to their group the unique perspective of someone who had collaborated with Roman authorities for personal profit, who understood the corruption of occupying power from inside its system, who knew what it meant to be despised by his own people for choices that had enriched him financially, while impoverishing him spiritually and socially. His transformation from tax collector to apostle became living proof that no past was too shameful, no reputation too damaged, no heart too hardened to be reached by divine love and restored to usefulness in the kingdom of heaven. Thomas, forever remembered primarily for his post-resurrection doubts rather than his pre-crucifixion courage, actually demonstrated tremendous loyalty and bravery throughout his years with Jesus, volunteering to accompany his master back into dangerous territory where religious authorities had threatened his life. His questions and uncertainties arose not from lack of love, but from desire to understand completely, to have solid foundations for faith that could withstand testing and persecution and the inevitable challenges that would come to anyone who chose to follow Jesus in a world often hostile to divine love. Simon the Zealot represented yet another background entirely, bringing to their fellowship the perspective of someone who had been involved with the political resistance movement that sought to overthrow Roman occupation through force and revolutionary violence. His presence among the 12, alongside Matthew, who had collaborated with the very forces Simon had opposed, demonstrated Jesus' ability to unite people whose natural inclinations would have made them enemies, creating unity not through compromise of convictions, but through shared devotion to love that transcended political divisions and personal prejudices. James the son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Less to distinguish him from the son of Zebedee, brought to their group the steady faithfulness of someone whose service was characterized more by consistent presence than dramatic gestures, whose devotion expressed itself through daily loyalty rather than spectacular demonstrations of commitment. His quiet reliability represented the countless, faithful hearts whose names may not be recorded in human histories, but whose persistent love makes possible every great work of divine grace in human communities. Thaddeus, also known as Judas the son of James, distinguished from Judas Iscariot by the loyalty that characterized his heart, rather than the betrayal that would mark the other, brought thoughtful questions to their conversations that revealed genuine wrestling with the mysteries of divine revelation and human response. At the Last Supper, he would ask Jesus why he chose to reveal himself to his disciples rather than to the world at large, demonstrating the kind of honest inquiry that seeks deeper understanding rather than superficial answers. And then there was Judas Iscariot, the most complex and tragic figure among the 12, a man of obvious intelligence and capability who was trusted enough to serve as their treasurer, who participated in their ministry and witnessed their miracles and heard their master's teachings firsthand, yet somewhere along the way allowed disappointment and greed and disillusionment to take root in his heart until they eventually grew into the betrayal that would echo through history as the ultimate example of how proximity to divine love does not guarantee transformation if the heart remains closed to its influence. Living in daily contact with these 11 very different personalities, Jesus demonstrated what it meant to love people, not because they were perfect, but because love itself is perfect. Not because they deserved affection, but because divine affection flows toward human hearts regardless of their worthiness or readiness to receive it properly. He saw through Peter's impulsive bluster to his genuine devotion, appreciated Andrew's humble service even when it received little public recognition, channeled the Sons of Thunder's passionate energy toward constructive purposes rather than destructive expressions. The disciples observed Jesus handling every conceivable situation with wisdom and grace that never seemed forced or artificial but flowed naturally from his perfect understanding of human nature and divine purpose. They watched him respond to hostile questions without losing patience or compromising truth, witnessed his interactions with women and children and outcasts that revealed divine love's consistency regardless of social status or cultural expectations, noticed that his private character matched his public teachings in ways that gave absolute credibility to everything he claimed about God's heart toward humanity. Chapter 10. Opposition and persecution as Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine and his message of radical love reached deeper into hearts that had been hardened by disappointment and religious legalism. The established authorities began to recognize him not as a welcome spiritual teacher, but as a fundamental threat to the carefully constructed systems through which they maintained their power, their prestige, and their comfortable arrangements with both religious tradition and political reality. What started as curiosity and skepticism gradually hardened into active opposition, and eventually into the kind of murderous hostility that reveals how threatening divine love can be to hearts that have chosen darkness over light, control over surrender, fear over faith. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law and careful attention to ritual requirements that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred. When his disciples picked grain on the Sabbath to satisfy their hunger, when he healed sick people on the day designated for rest, when he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners, without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing had taken place, he was challenging not just their practices but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor God and live according to divine will. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions, but expressions of genuine concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom. They had spent their lives learning to navigate the complex requirements of religious law, creating elaborate systems designed to help people avoid accidentally breaking divine commandments, building careful fences around biblical precepts to ensure no one could inadvertently step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective regulations seemed to them like carelessness at best and blasphemy at worst. Jesus' responses to their criticisms revealed the heart issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride, how quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation, how subtly the desire to serve God could be corrupted into desire to be recognized as especially godly by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval. When he told them that the Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for the Sabbath, he was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values. The Sadducees, who controlled the temple and its lucrative operations while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities, saw Jesus as a threat to the delicate balance they had achieved between religious autonomy and imperial oversight. They didn't share the Pharisees' concern about ceremonial purity or detailed law observance, but they were deeply worried about anyone whose growing popularity might attract unwanted attention from Roman governors who had little patience for Jewish religious movements that could be interpreted as politically subversive or socially destabilizing. Their opposition to Jesus was primarily practical rather than theological, motivated more by concern for institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreement. They understood that Roman rule depended on local cooperation and that any disruption in the peaceful administration of their territory could result in harsh crackdowns that would destroy their privileged position and potentially bring disaster to their entire nation. Jesus' miracle-working power and crowd-drawing charisma represented exactly the kind of phenomenon that could be misinterpreted by suspicious imperial administrators as dangerous to Roman interests. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions. Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings, because he spoke with the immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity that made their elaborate, scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant. Their professional identity was built on being the recognized experts in matters of religious law and spiritual interpretation. the ones to whom ordinary people looked for guidance about proper belief and acceptable behavior. Jesus' ability to teach profound truths in simple language that connected directly with human hearts bypassed their mediating function, making their specialized knowledge seem unnecessary and their authority appear questionable in ways that threatened both their livelihood and their sense of purpose. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts or before Roman tribunals. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping to make him choose between alienating Jewish patriots who resented foreign taxation and giving them grounds to accuse him of sedition against imperial authority. They brought cases like the woman caught in adultery, demanding judgments that would require him to choose between mercy and justice, between compassion and legal compliance. Time after time, Jesus' responses demonstrated wisdom that transcended human cleverness, revealing divine understanding that could satisfy the deepest requirements of both justice and mercy, both truth and love, both respect for authority and compassion for human weakness. His answer about rendering to Caesar what belonged to Caesar, while rendering to God what belonged to God, acknowledged legitimate governmental authority, while maintaining the primacy of divine claims on human hearts. His response to the adultery case invited anyone without sin to cast the first stone, then offered the woman both forgiveness and challenge to transformation. When intellectual challenges failed to discredit Jesus publicly, some religious leaders resorted to more desperate measures, suggesting that he performed his miracles through demonic power rather than divine authority, accusing him of being in league with forces of evil rather than agents of divine love. This blasphemous accusation revealed the depths of spiritual blindness that opposition to divine truth could create, showing how hearts determined to reject divine love could eventually lose their ability to distinguish between good and evil, between light and darkness, between divine grace and satanic deception. Jesus' response to this ultimate accusation was both patient and stern, explaining that Satan could not cast out Satan because divided kingdoms could not stand, while warning about the spiritual danger of attributing the obvious works of God's Spirit to evil sources. This wasn't divine vindictiveness, but spiritual reality, recognition that people who consistently chose to call good evil and light darkness were in danger of destroying their own capacity for moral discernment and spiritual perception. The political opposition to Jesus also intensified as his popularity grew, and his message began to be interpreted through the lens of contemporary expectations about divine deliverance from foreign occupation. Herod Antipas, the puppet ruler who governed Galilee under Roman oversight, became increasingly nervous about Jesus' growing following, remembering his own troubled conscience over his execution of John the Baptist and wondering if this new teacher might represent an even greater threat to his precarious hold on power. The crowds that gathered to hear Jesus could easily become political rallies, and political gatherings of any size made Roman administrators extremely suspicious about possible seditious activities. Some of the opposition came from sincere religious conviction, rather than political calculation or professional jealousy. There were people who genuinely believed that Jesus' claims about his relationship with God were blasphemous, that his casual attitude toward certain traditional practices was spiritually dangerous, that his influence was leading people away from true faith rather than toward it. These opponents weren't necessarily motivated by selfish concerns, but by honest conviction that they were protecting divine truth from dangerous innovation and defending their people from spiritual deception. The growing hostility created an atmosphere of constant tension that affected not only Jesus but also his disciples, who found themselves associated with an increasingly controversial figure. whose teachings challenged established authorities, and whose presence seemed to generate conflict wherever he went. Their families worried about them. Their former associates began to distance themselves. Some potential followers were deterred by the obvious risks involved in public identification with someone who was attracting such negative attention from powerful people who could make life very difficult for his supporters. Yet through all of this mounting opposition, Jesus maintained his character and his mission with remarkable consistency, never responding to attack with counterattack, to hostility with hostility, to persecution with the kind of bitterness that would have been completely understandable under such circumstances. He continued healing the sick and teaching the crowds with the same compassion he had always shown, continued demonstrating love even toward those who opposed him most vigorously, continued offering grace to critics and enemies with the same generosity he extended to disciples and supporters. This response to persecution became one of his most powerful teaching methods, showing his followers through personal example what it meant to love enemies and pray for persecutors, to turn the other cheek when struck, to overcome evil with good rather than fighting darkness with darkness. His life became a living demonstration of the principles he taught, proving that such radical love was not merely idealistic theory, but practical reality for anyone willing to trust completely in divine grace and strength. The intensifying opposition served to clarify the choice that every person who encountered Jesus eventually had to make regarding his identity and claims. It became increasingly impossible to remain neutral about him, to treat him as merely another interesting teacher, whose ideas could be considered alongside other philosophical options. His assertions about his relationship with God were too dramatic, his character too compelling, his miracles too obvious for casual indifference or comfortable dismissal. As the conflict reached its climax, Jesus began to speak more openly with his disciples about the suffering that awaited him, trying to prepare them for the reality that following him would involve sharing in his sufferings, that the same world that rejected him would also reject them, that they should expect persecution rather than popularity, opposition rather than approval from the established powers of their time. But he also assured them that such suffering would have meaning and purpose, that it would participate in God's larger plan for human redemption, that their temporary losses would be transformed into eternal gains through divine power that could bring resurrection, life from apparent death. Chapter 11. The final journey to Jerusalem. The time had come for Jesus to set his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense the shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to the holy city where prophets had always come to die, and where the ultimate demonstration of divine love would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice for the sake of human redemption. The relaxed pace of his Galilean ministry was drawing to a close as he gathered his disciples for the pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation. His closest followers recognized that something had changed in their master's attitude and approach, though they struggled to understand the nature of the transformation they were witnessing. There was a new intensity in his prayers, a deeper urgency in his teaching, a quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite the obvious dangers that awaited him there. The religious authorities had already made their hostility clear. The political climate was charged with tension that could explode into violence at any moment. Yet Jesus moved toward the center of this danger with the steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into and why such apparent foolishness was actually the wisest course of action possible. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness, their excitement about accompanying their master to the holy city during Passover season, mixed with increasing anxiety about what such a journey might cost them all. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with his Father about the mission that was reaching its climactic moment. Their hearts troubled by words they occasionally overheard about suffering and death that made no sense in the context of the kingdom they had been expecting him to establish through demonstrations of irresistible power. Others hung back in the group, whispering among themselves about the wisdom of this journey, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be the final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and the families who depended on them for support and protection. The crowds that had celebrated his miracles in Galilee might not be so welcoming in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and political sensitivity was heightened by proximity to Roman administrative centers. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond, some seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones. Others simply curious about the man who had become the subject of so much discussion and debate. Many joined the growing procession, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, participating in events that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Among those who joined their journey were people whose lives had been transformed by Jesus' ministry over the previous 3 years, former outcasts who had been welcomed into his fellowship, healed individuals whose restoration had become permanent testimony to divine power, families whose children had been blessed by his touch, and whose hearts had been changed by his teachings about divine love. Their presence turned the journey into a kind of living parade of grace, a mobile demonstration of what happened when divine love encountered human need with practical compassion. But there were also those who followed with darker intentions, agents sent by religious authorities to monitor Jesus' activities and report back on his movements. Roman officials concerned about any gathering that might become politically disruptive. Curiosity seekers whose interest was more entertainment than transformation. The atmosphere surrounding the procession was charged with competing expectations and conflicting purposes that created tension even in the midst of celebration. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, the small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before. Providing a place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from the demands of public ministry. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead the stage for the most dramatic miracle of his entire ministry, the raising of Lazarus from the dead after 4 days in the tomb. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found the household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving the loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy. Their questions revealed the kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith, the struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses that seem preventable and unnecessary. Jesus' response to their grief was not philosophical explanation, but practical demonstration, not theological discourse about the mysteries of divine will, but immediate action that revealed divine heart in ways no amount of teaching could accomplish. Standing before Lazarus' tomb, he commanded that the stone be rolled away despite Martha's protests about the condition of a body that had been dead for 4 days. Then, in a voice that carried the authority of divine life over death itself, he called, "Lazarus, come out." The miracle that followed sent shockwaves throughout the region and beyond, as Lazarus emerged from the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths, very much alive and completely restored to the fullness of human existence. For many witnesses, this unprecedented demonstration of power over death itself confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, the Messiah they had been waiting for, the one who possessed authority over life and death in ways that belonged only to divine nature. But for the religious authorities, this miracle represented the final threat that could not be tolerated, the definitive proof that Jesus must be eliminated before his influence became so great that it would be impossible to contain. The chief priests and Pharisees convened emergency meetings to discuss how they might arrest him without causing the kind of public disturbance that could lead to Roman intervention and potential disaster for their entire nation. Their concern was as much political as theological, recognizing that Jesus' growing popularity could be interpreted by suspicious imperial administrators as dangerous to Roman interests. Caiaphas, the high priest, cut through their debate with chilling pragmatism that would prove prophetic in ways he never intended. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He thought he was making a cold political calculation, but his words actually expressed divine truth about the substitutionary sacrifice that Jesus would soon make, dying not just for Israel, but for all humanity, taking upon himself the sins of the world, so that whoever believed in him might not perish, but have eternal life. From that moment, the plot against Jesus' life moved from theoretical discussion to operational planning, as religious leaders began actively seeking ways to arrest him quietly, without the kind of public confrontation that might provoke rioting among his supporters. They knew they would need help from within his inner circle, someone who could provide information about his movements and activities that would allow them to take him into custody, away from the crowds who might attempt to defend him. Meanwhile, Jesus continued his approach to Jerusalem, knowing full well what awaited him there, but also understanding that this path of suffering was the only way to accomplish the redemption he had come to provide. The only means by which divine love could triumph over human sin and death could be conquered permanently. His journey was not the march of a victim being led to slaughter, but the purposeful progress of a sacrifice being offered voluntarily, the deliberate movement of love toward its ultimate expression. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. In an upper room that had been carefully prepared according to Jesus' specific instructions, as shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and the golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness the most intimate and heartbreaking scene in human history, Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew would be their final meal together before everything they had shared for 3 years would be shattered by betrayal, suffering, and apparent defeat that would test their faith beyond anything they could imagine enduring. The Passover celebration that spread before them carried the accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, each prayer and symbolic food reminding them of God's faithfulness to his covenant people throughout their long history of wandering and waiting for ultimate redemption. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into the foundation of future salvation. As they reclined around the low table in the posture traditional for festive meals, sharing the intimate fellowship that had sustained them through 3 years of ministry together, there was an atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension that none of them could quite identify or explain. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while also displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs and disappointments. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer," Jesus told them, his voice carrying both anticipation and sorrow that penetrated their hearts, even though they could not yet understand what he meant by suffering, or why their beloved teacher would speak of such things on what should have been a joyful occasion. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. The words hung in the air like a prophecy they could not decipher, a promise wrapped in mystery that would only become clear through the devastating and glorious events of the next 3 days. Before they began the formal meal, Jesus did something that shocked them all into stunned silence, something so unexpected and inappropriate by social standards that they struggled to process what they were witnessing. He rose from his place at the table, removed his outer garments, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash their feet like the most menial servant in a household, performing work that even slaves often tried to avoid, because it placed them in such a position of humiliation. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing what they all felt about the impropriety of their master kneeling before them with basin and towel, serving them in ways that reversed every normal understanding of authority and respect. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" he asked, his question carrying undertones of shock and embarrassment at witnessing such divine humility. When Jesus explained that Peter didn't understand now, but would understand later, Peter's response was characteristically absolute. "No, you shall never wash my feet." But Jesus' gentle insistence revealed the deeper significance of what was happening, the spiritual truth being enacted through this physical demonstration of service and love. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me," he said, his words transforming the foot washing from mere object lesson about humility into profound symbol of the cleansing that his coming sacrifice would provide for anyone willing to receive it. Peter's typical swing from one extreme to the other, requesting full body washing once he understood the spiritual implications, showed how completely he misunderstood while simultaneously revealing his genuine desire to be connected to Jesus in every possible way. When Jesus finished washing their feet and returned to his place at the table, he made the lesson explicit while demonstrating through actions the principles he had been teaching through words. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." As they began sharing the Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, Jesus took the unleavened bread that commemorated their ancestors' hasty departure from Egypt and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity. "Take and eat," he said, breaking the bread and distributing it among them. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The simple act of sharing bread, something they had done together countless times during their travels, was suddenly charged with significance that would make every future meal a reminder of divine love poured out completely. Similarly, the cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing became the symbol of a new covenant, sealed not with the blood of sacrificial animals, but with Jesus' own life poured out for the redemption of humanity. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," he told them as they shared the wine, "which is poured out for you." The disciples received these elements with reverence, though they could not yet grasp the full significance of what Jesus was telling them, could not comprehend that they were participating in the inauguration of a new relationship between God and humanity. But then the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as Jesus made an announcement that sent shock waves through their intimate fellowship. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The words fell like stones into the peaceful atmosphere of their gathering, creating ripples of confusion and distress that reached every heart around the table. One by one they asked, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at the possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery. Jesus didn't immediately identify the betrayer, but he gave a sign that revealed his supernatural knowledge of human hearts and divine plan. The one who dips his bread into the bowl with me will betray me. When Judas Iscariot dipped his bread, Jesus spoke to him quietly but audibly. What you are about to do, do quickly. The other disciples didn't understand what was happening, some assuming Jesus was sending Judas on an errand related to their meal or their ministry to the poor, having no idea they were witnessing the moment when one of their own made his final choice between love and silver. After Judas departed into the darkness that seemed to symbolize the spiritual condition of his heart, Jesus spoke more openly with his remaining disciples about what was coming, trying to prepare them for separation. They couldn't imagine surviving and loss they couldn't believe was possible. He told them that he would be with them only a little longer, that where he was going, they could not immediately follow, though they would join him eventually in ways they could not yet understand. Peter, still not comprehending the nature of what was approaching, declared his willingness to die for Jesus, his bold promise revealing both genuine love and dangerous overconfidence in his own strength and faithfulness. Jesus' response was gentle but realistic, prophesying Peter's coming denial while also offering hope for restoration. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But even this prediction of failure was wrapped in grace, as Jesus assured Peter that he had prayed for him, that his faith would not fail completely, and that after his recovery he would strengthen his brothers. Instead of dwelling on the coming betrayal and denial, Jesus filled the remaining hours with words of comfort and promise that would sustain his followers through the dark days ahead and across the centuries that would follow. Do not let your hearts be troubled, he told them. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From the peaceful intimacy of the upper room where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant had been established through shared bread and wine, Jesus led his disciples through the sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward a garden called Gethsemane, a place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with his Father, but which tonight would become the arena for the most intense spiritual battle ever fought on earth, the struggle between divine will and human nature, between love's determination to save and natural recoil from the suffering required to accomplish such salvation. The garden that had been a sanctuary of peace during their previous visits felt different this night, charged with an atmosphere of impending crisis that even the disciples could sense, despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching. Jesus' demeanor had changed from the tender intimacy of their meal together to something heavier, more burdened, revealing the weight of divine mission as it reached its climactic moment when all the accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into one terrible experience of separation from the Father's love. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, Jesus told Peter, James, and John, the 3 disciples he had chosen to accompany him deeper into the garden while the others waited nearby. Stay here and keep watch with me. His words revealed the profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing the complete range of human emotion, including anguish so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength, revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience, including its darkest moments. Moving beyond even these closest companions, Jesus fell face down on the ground in prayer that revealed the ultimate submission of divine will to divine purpose, the perfect harmony between Father and Son that was willing to embrace even separation for the sake of human redemption. My Father, he prayed, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The cup he referenced was not merely physical death, but the spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin, experiencing the separation from divine love that sin creates, drinking the full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself. 3 times he prayed this prayer, and 3 times he returned to find his disciples sleeping, unable to keep watch with him during his hour of greatest need, their failure revealing the human inability to comprehend or participate in the depth of what divine love was willing to endure for their salvation. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter, the disciple who had promised to die with him, revealing not anger but loneliness that made his suffering even more profound. The isolation that comes when those we love most cannot stay present with us in our darkest moments. As Jesus emerged from his final time of prayer, strengthened by angelic ministry, but confirmed in his commitment to drink the cup his Father had prepared for him, the sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches broke the garden's sacred silence. Judas arrived leading a crowd of soldiers and temple guards, armed with swords and clubs, as if they were arresting a dangerous criminal rather than a teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion, whose only crime had been demonstrating divine mercy in ways that threatened earthly power structures. The betrayal was accomplished through a kiss, the traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into a signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery, trust transformed into the most infamous act of betrayal in human history. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection, Jesus called Judas friend, extending grace to the very one who was delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to the heart that had chosen silver over loyalty, temporary gain over eternal treasure. When Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus immediately rebuked this attempt at violent resistance, healing the wounded man even as his own captors bound his hands, demonstrating mercy toward enemies even in the moment of his arrest. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" he asked. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for a predetermined conclusion. They brought forward false witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other, asked trick questions designed to entrap Jesus into statements that could be construed as blasphemy or sedition, and ultimately condemned him for the crime of claiming to be who he actually was, the Son of God. When the high priest demanded a direct answer, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God," Jesus knew that answering truthfully would seal his fate, but he could not deny his identity to save his life. "You have said so," he replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest's dramatic response, tearing his clothes and declaring this blasphemy, revealed spiritual blindness so complete that divine truth appeared to be ultimate falsehood. The Roman trial before Pontius Pilate revealed the political dimensions of Jesus' execution, as religious charges of blasphemy were translated into accusations of sedition and treason that might concern imperial authorities. When Pilate questioned Jesus about his kingship, Jesus' response revealed the fundamental difference between his mission and any earthly political agenda. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. But now my kingdom is from another place." Pilate's repeated declarations that he found no basis for charges against Jesus, his attempts to release him through various legal maneuvers, his symbolic hand washing to disclaim responsibility for an execution he was nevertheless authorizing, all revealed the tragic consequences of choosing political expedience over moral courage, personal preservation over standing for truth and justice. The Roman soldiers' mockery of Jesus before his crucifixion, placing a crown of thorns on his head and a purple robe on his shoulders while they beat and spat on him, was intended as ridicule of a false king, but actually constituted unwitting worship of the true king, whose throne would be a cross and whose crown would indeed be thorns, but whose kingdom would outlast every earthly empire that ever risen or would ever rise. The crucifixion itself represented the most excruciating form of execution the ancient world had devised, designed not merely to kill but to torture, to humiliate, to serve as public deterrent to anyone who might consider opposing Roman authority. Yet in God's providence, this instrument of torture and shame became the means by which divine love made its ultimate statement about human worth, the altar on which perfect sacrifice was offered for imperfect humanity. Even in his agony, Jesus' words from the cross revealed a heart that remained focused on others rather than his own suffering, offering forgiveness to his executioners, paradise to the repentant thief crucified beside him, provision for his mother's care, and ultimately the triumphant declaration that his mission was accomplished. It is finished. The work of redemption was complete, the price of human sin fully paid, the way opened for anyone to approach divine love without fear of rejection or condemnation. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in the profound silence that followed Jesus' death, a silence broken only by the weeping of those who loved him and the awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented. The very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed the completion of the most significant event in human history, the voluntary sacrifice of divine love for human redemption, the payment of an infinite price for the eternal freedom of anyone willing to receive such extravagant grace, through simple faith and grateful surrender. The Roman centurion who supervised the crucifixion, a professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed. Surely this was a righteous man, and according to some accounts, truly this man was the Son of God. Even this hardened military officer, trained to maintain emotional distance from the suffering he was required to oversee, could not remain unmoved by the manner of Jesus' death, the forgiveness he had extended to his executioners, the dignity he had maintained throughout his ordeal. As evening approached, and the Sabbath drew near, Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the ruling council who had been a secret follower of Jesus, found courage to request permission from Pilate to bury the body properly rather than allowing it to be thrown into the common grave reserved for executed criminals. This was an act of considerable bravery that publicly identified him with the condemned man and could have cost him his position, his reputation, and possibly his life. But love compelled him to ensure that Jesus received honorable burial befitting his true identity. Together with Nicodemus, another member of the religious establishment who had come to Jesus under cover of darkness, seeking spiritual truth, and had apparently found more than he had expected, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from the cross and prepared it for burial according to Jewish custom. They wrapped the body in linen cloths with expensive spices and placed it in a new tomb that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved out of rock in a garden near the place of crucifixion. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from a distance as he died and noting carefully where his body was laid, planned to return after the Sabbath to complete the burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time, constraints imposed by approaching Holy Day. Observances. Their devotion compelled them to perform this final act of love for the teacher who had transformed their lives, even though their hearts were breaking with grief and their faith was shattered by apparent failure of everything they had believed and hoped. The religious authorities, remembering Jesus' predictions about rising from the dead on the third day, requested that Pilate post guards at the tomb and seal it officially to prevent disciples from stealing the body and claiming a resurrection had occurred. Pilate granted their request, and Roman soldiers were stationed with orders to prevent any disturbance, their very presence serving ironically to make the coming miracle more undeniable and their precautions more obviously inadequate against divine power. The Sabbath passed in crushing sorrow for Jesus' followers, who huddled together behind locked doors, overwhelmed by grief and confusion, struggling to process the apparent collapse of everything they had given their lives to follow. Their dreams of his kingdom being established seemed to have died with him on the cross, their hopes for liberation and restoration apparently buried with his body in the sealed tomb, their understanding of divine purpose shattered by events that contradicted every expectation they had formed about Messiah's mission. But while they mourned what appeared to be ultimate defeat, something unprecedented was stirring in the tomb where Jesus' body had been laid, something that would transform their grief into joy, their despair into hope, their confusion into clarity about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purpose. Death, which had seemed to have the final word in the story of divine love's encounter with human need, was about to be revealed as merely a temporary interruption in an eternal relationship between Creator and creation. Early on the first day of the week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem, Mary Magdalene made her way to the tomb, carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Her heart heavy with sorrow, but her devotion compelling her to perform this final act of service for the one who had freed her from demonic oppression and given her life meaning and purpose she had never imagined possible. She expected to find the tomb sealed and guarded, the body of her beloved teacher still wrapped in burial cloths, the finality of death confirmed by the sight of his lifeless form. But when she arrived at the garden tomb, she discovered something that challenged every assumption about the permanence of death and the limitation of divine power. The massive stone that had sealed the entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at an angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant. Angels whose very presence transformed the tomb into a sanctuary of divine glory greeted her bewilderment with words that would echo through eternity. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him." When Mary ran to tell the disciples what she had found, her words tumbled over each other in excitement and confusion as she struggled to communicate an experience that transcended ordinary language and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him," she gasped, still unable to fully process the possibility that death itself had been conquered, that the grave had been robbed of its ultimate victory. Peter and John raced to the tomb to verify her report, their hearts pounding with mixture of hope and disbelief as their feet carried them toward evidence that would either confirm their worst fears or exceed their wildest dreams. John arrived first, but waited for Peter at the entrance, and Peter characteristically rushed inside to examine the evidence firsthand. Seeing the linen cloths lying undisturbed and the face cloth folded neatly by itself, everything arranged with care that suggested purposeful departure rather than hasty theft. John followed Peter into the empty tomb and saw the same evidence, but his response was different. he saw and believed. The careful arrangement of the grave clothes, the obvious absence of the body, the supernatural nature of what had occurred all combined to convince John that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, that death had been conquered by divine love, that hope was not only restored, but vindicated in the most wonderful way imaginable. Later that same day, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene as she wept outside the tomb, speaking her name in the familiar voice she had learned to love and follow, revealing himself as alive and victorious over death itself. Her joy at recognizing him was tempered only by his instruction not to cling to him, as he had not yet ascended to the Father, but to go and tell the disciples that he was alive and that their relationship with God had been transformed through his sacrifice and resurrection. That evening, as the disciples gathered behind locked doors, paralyzed by fear of what religious authorities might do to them now that their master was gone, Jesus appeared among them with words that transformed their terror into overwhelming joy. "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands and side, proving his identity through the wounds of crucifixion, while demonstrating that his resurrection was complete restoration to life, not mere spiritual survival, but bodily triumph over death itself. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at the gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through the life and love of Jesus Christ, as the peaceful darkness of night settles around you like the most comforting embrace, and your breathing naturally deepens into the rhythm of blessed rest, I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared, walking together through the most beautiful and transformative story ever told. Experiencing together the love that has changed countless hearts across the centuries, and continues to change hearts tonight, including your own precious heart that has been touched by divine grace in ways that will echo through your tomorrows. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling weary beyond words, possibly questioning your worth, or wondering if there truly existed a love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles. We conclude with you held securely in the embrace of that very love, surrounded by the truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond measure by the one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet numbers every hair on your head, who sustains the entire cosmos, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart. The Jesus we have encountered together in these quiet hours is not merely a figure from ancient history, confined to the pages of old books or the memories of bygone civilizations, but a living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances, speaking to your contemporary struggles with the same voice that calmed storms and comforted mourners 2,000 years ago. The cross we witnessed together was not simply a tragic end to a beautiful life, but the ultimate demonstration of divine love willing to pay any price for human redemption, the definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it, no heart so broken that divine love cannot heal it completely. The resurrection we celebrated revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment, but victorious power. Not wishful thinking, but eternal reality. Not temporary comfort, but permanent transformation available to anyone willing to receive it with simple faith. If this sacred journey has brought even a moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under the weight of disappointment and discouragement, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to the love that holds the universe together, Then you have discovered treasure worth guarding, worth returning to whenever life becomes overwhelming. Worth sharing with others who are searching for the same peace you have found tonight. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world. A gathering of hearts that understand rest is sacred, that recognize peace as revolutionary, that choose contemplation over constant activity as the wiser path toward what matters most in human existence. By joining our family through subscription, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption, entering into fellowship with people who have discovered that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up, that silence teaches more wisdom than noise, that some realities can only be perceived when we create space for them to settle into hearts prepared by stillness and surrender. Your voice matters tremendously in this sacred conversation we are having together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to the tapestry of testimony that encourages every heart that encounters it. Please share with us in the comments below what this journey has meant to you. What particular moments in Jesus' story have spoken most directly to your own need? What peace has been awakened in places of your heart that had grown accustomed to anxiety or fear? There is no requirement for profound theological insights or perfect spiritual understanding, simply an invitation to share whatever these hours have stirred in your soul, knowing that your honesty creates permission for others to be equally authentic about their own struggles and discoveries. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content online, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their questions too simple, or their understanding too limited to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth. But remember the disciples we have observed throughout these stories, ordinary men with extraordinary flaws who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were chosen by Jesus and entrusted with the most important message in human history because their hearts remained open to transformation through divine grace. Your questions reveal a seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort and challenge. Your struggles connect you to the universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment. And sharing those struggles gives others courage to acknowledge their own need for the kind of love that never fails or abandons those who turn to it in their desperation. Your discoveries, however small they might seem to you, testify to the reality of divine love working in contemporary hearts, proving that the Jesus we have encountered in these ancient stories continues to transform lives in our modern world. In the weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess the power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits. Journeying together through the experiences of saints and mystics who discovered God in desert silences and mountain solitudes, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges. We will meditate on psalms and prayers that have sustained believers through persecution and prosperity, through seasons of abundance and times of desperate need, always finding in them fresh resources for whatever difficulties or joys we may be facing. We will visit the gentle wisdom of Teresa of Avila, who learned to find God in the interior castle of her own soul and map the territories of mystical prayer for anyone willing to venture into deeper relationship with divine love. We will explore the radical simplicity of the Desert Fathers, who fled the distractions of civilization to discover in solitude the presence that had always surrounded them, but required silence to be perceived clearly. We will discover how contemplatives across traditions and centuries have found pathways to peace that remain available to anyone willing to walk them with sincere hearts and patient persistence. Each story we explore together will be crafted with the same loving care as tonight's journey, designed to help you transition from whatever anxieties have marked your day to the blessing of peaceful rest that comes from knowing you are completely loved. Always intended to remind you that you are precious beyond your ability to comprehend. Always created to serve as a bridge between the chaos of worldly concerns and the tranquility of divine grace that surrounds you, whether you are conscious of it or not. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension, how your breathing has slowed to the gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are safe in arms that will never grow weary of holding them, how your heart has found its natural pace of rest in the presence of love that requires nothing from you except your willingness to be loved, without reservation or condition. You don't need to understand everything about divine truth to benefit from its reality. Don't need to have perfect faith to receive perfect love. Don't need to achieve spiritual maturity before you can rest in spiritual grace. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into the blessed unconsciousness, where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for words or awareness to reach. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for this time we have shared, for the love you have encountered, for the peace that has taken root in your heart, like a seed that will continue growing even while you sleep, producing fruit of joy and hope and renewed strength for whatever tomorrow may bring. You are falling asleep tonight, not merely into natural rest, but into the everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved children of the God who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy in His presence. Your sleep tonight participates in the rest that Jesus promised to all who come to Him with their burdens. The rest that restores not just physical energy but spiritual vitality, not just bodily strength but soul satisfaction. Dream peaceful dreams tonight, dear friend. Dreams filled with the love we have explored together. Visions of the grace that surrounds you. Glimpses of the hope that now burns steadily in your heart, like a candle that no wind can extinguish and no darkness can overcome. When morning comes, you will awaken not only refreshed in body, but renewed in spirit. Not only rested from today's labors, but prepared for tomorrow's opportunities to experience and express the love that has claimed you as its own. May the peace of Christ, which surpasses all human understanding, guard your heart and mind through this night and always. May you rest secure in the knowledge that you are loved with everlasting love, accepted with unconditional grace, and held by hands that will never let you go regardless of what storms may rage around you or what challenges may test your faith. May your days ahead be filled with growing awareness of divine presence, your nights with peaceful rest in divine love, your entire life with the joy that comes from knowing you belong to the love that will never end. Sweet dreams, precious child of God. Sleep well in the love that conquered death, the grace that makes all things new, the hope that anchors souls through every storm and leads them safely home to the heart of divine love, where every tear is wiped away and every sorrow is transformed into eternal joy. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest, may you know beyond any doubt that you are beloved, you are precious, you are exactly who God created you to be, and you are destined for more beauty and joy than your heart can currently imagine. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as the love that created you and will never stop believing in the wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently and persistently in the depths of your being. Good night, dear one. May angels watch over your sleep and divine love fill your dreams until morning brings fresh mercies and new opportunities to experience the grace that is always flowing toward you like a river that never runs dry, like a spring that never fails, like a love that never ends. We will journey together again soon through more stories of grace, more encounters with divine love, more moments of sacred rest for souls that need the comfort only God can provide. But for now, simply rest, simply receive, simply be held by the love that is stronger than death and more enduring than time itself. Amen and amen, beloved friend. Sleep peacefully in the arms of infinite love until we meet again.